Good morning, and happy to see that so many have survived the first 2 days and the last dinner. And it will be indeed a keynote lecture because I will be using the Apple software called Keynote. I hope it works because I don't have anything else than the slides. Indeed, as you all remember, we were asked by the organizers to reflect on or to answer to this difficult question: what is the role of philosophy of history? And when I started to ponder on this question, I realized very quickly that it has to be more specific. And I thought that actually we have to ask, what is the role of philosophy of history for whom and when? And after some reflection, I decided that this when question should refer to this human condition right now, to this situation on the planet Earth that we are currently living in. And quite immediately, the concept of Anthropocene came to my mind. I will come back later to this concept, but I feel that this is indeed a concept that very well captures the present and the near future human condition. And therefore, it might be interesting to reflect on the role of philosophy of history at the time of Anthropocene. And then the question, what is the role of philosophy of history for whom? And here I have to be quite subjective and confess that by my training and by my current job, I'm a professional historian with strong interest in the philosophy and theory of history. But however, for me, the role of the philosophy of history is first and foremost to make sense of what historians are doing, to explain historical research. And therefore, I'm interested into the role of the philosophy of history for historians, for historical research. So actually, this is the question that will be my guiding line throughout this paper. But even put in this way, it's still quite ambitious and probably too large for such a small talk. So actually narrowed it down to this kind of question: what kind of notion of history do we need at the time of Anthropocene? And actually this will be my question in this talk, and I won't promise that you will get an answer at the end, but actually I would like to reflect on this question and the possible consequences or repercussions of this kind of question. Now, to give you a plan of my talk, I hope to tackle 4 points. First, of course, in the area of introduction, I will have to try to explain this concept of Anthropocene. Especially, it's not an easy concept, and there's different understanding, different definitions of the concept. But even more, I would like to underline the importance of this concept, the relevance of this concept for history and for philosophy of history. Then secondly, and this will be the main kind of philosophical contribution in this lecture, I would like to discuss this deeply rooted divide, or division between nature and history since early 19th century at latest. And then finally, I hope to offer 2 possible perspectives for a new understanding of history, both as a field and, why not, as a concept. First is what I call more than human history, that in my mind is appropriate for the time of Anthropocene. And next, another approach, what is being called the deep history. And in connection to this concept of deep history, I would also like to raise the question of what kind of notion of time do we need for this new human condition we call Anthropocene. Now, of course, this first difficult question, what is Anthropocene? I don't have any clue how familiar you are with this concept. Mostly, I think most people do know it, but anyhow, just some basic clarifications. First, of course, this is a kind of new buzzword. Over the last 5-6 years, it has become viral. It has spread over different disciplines in academia, both in humanities and social sciences as well as in natural sciences. The concept was coined in 2000, 17 years ago, by geologists. There were some earlier kind of predecessors from the mid-20th century, but basically it was born this millennium. And in the very basic or wider sense, this concept or term refers to this anthropogenic influence on Earth geology and ecosystems, and it can be translated in a simplified ways as the epoch of humans. But what is important to underline that first, this term doesn't have yet an official status, meaning that it hasn't been approved officially by the relevant organizations, the International Commission of Stratigraphy and the National Commission of Association of Geologists, but I think it will come in the near future. At least we have first signs, because I've been in this working group on Anthropocene for many years, and they have already made official proposition for the organization of geologists to declare that the Holocene is over and Anthropocene is on its way. And secondly, of course, we have to underline that there is no unanimous, no consensus definition of Anthropocene. You have very different readings, and needless to say, there is open debate about the very beginning of the Anthropocene. But I won't go into details because this is not exactly our aim. For me, it's important to claim, and of course take it for granted from my side, namely that this concept challenges very much many of our certainties, and first of all, challenges how we look at nature, at ourselves, of humanity, and last not least, how we look at the past. Now, just to remind some basic information, as you know, the geological history of the Earth is divided into different periods, actually into eons, divided into eras, divided into periods, divided into epochs. And so the question is whether the Holocene, which has lasted over the last 12,000 years or so, is coming to its end, or already has ended, and being replaced by the new epoch, Anthropocene, which is not that neutral term, because it very much has a kind of apocalyptic dimension, because most probably it looks like it will be the last epoch, at least for the humans. But again, I won't dwell on this. There's another way to represent the history of the planet in the form of a time spiral, which starts from the Big Bang and then keeps on, and we have arrived at this Holocene epoch, and the question is whether it will be continued by another period. But just again, gives maybe an idea that we will come back later that actually it's a very little piece of the Earth's history. Now, the reasons why increasing number of scholars in different disciplines are talking about the emergence or arrival of the Anthropocene is, of course, the phenomenon called the Great Acceleration. I suppose most of you have seen this kind of slides before, which points out that especially since 1950s, we have a dramatic rise in different socioeconomic and Earth system trends, that we have a rapid increase of bird population, of urban population, of water use, of large dams, of transportation, of telecommunication, etc. And also we have a rapid and dramatic change in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, in tropical forest loss, in domesticated land, in coastal nitrogen, etc., etc. So all those different factors put together gives us a major change on our Earth. That's the hypothesis, human impacted or anthropogenic. And this, of course, also forces us to think whether the dominant notion of human and the nature is still viable for the near future. Of course, many lessons can be learned from the Anthropocene, at least from the hypothesis of Anthropocene. I would just like to pick up some of them. The first was well pointed out by two French scholars recently, Christophe Bonneuil and Jean-Baptiste Fressoz, in the book The Shock of the Anthropocene. And to remind indeed that one of the outcomes of this new theory of Anthropocene is the, let's say, the collapse of this great divide between nature and society that widened in the 19th and 20th century. And as an outcome, of course, this collapse of this division also turns upside down the relations between humanities and social sciences and natural sciences on the other hand. And as they mention, now it is the science of the Earth system and no longer historians who name the epoch in which we are living. But these main consequences have been put more succinctly by another French well-known scholar, Bruno Latour, in his recent unpublished lecture. In a meeting of the American Association of Anthropologists, namely, he claims that Anthropocene will most probably give a new definition of time, new definition of space, a new definition of our relations to other non-human beings or the animated agencies. And this will be also very much my own starting point to reflect about the possible consequences of Anthropocene for history and philosophy of history. And to try to summarize the things as I see them, namely, Anthropocene indeed requires a new concept of history that radically decenters humans and positions our actions in a deep co-evolutionary time. In other words, we have to reconceptualize our relations in the present as well as in the past to the rest of the life forms on this planet. In other words, we have to understand in a new way our relations to the more than human world. And of course, this redefinition requires also to overcome or transcend many quite deeply rooted divisions in historical epistemology, distinctions between natural history and human history, between written history and deep history based on non-written materials, including DNA information, human history and multi-species history, national history and planetary or global history, and so on and so forth. Now, I think the key author who has very much launched the Anthropocene debate among historians is the Indian-American historian Dipesh Chakrabarty, who is in this very well-known and much debated article published in Critical Inquiry in 2009, entitled The Climate of History, 4 theses, argued almost for the first time about the possible consequences of the Anthropocene. Actually doesn't use yet the concept in this article, talks about climate change and global warming, but the idea is already there. So about the possible consequences of the Anthropocene for the discipline of history. And he points out indeed that the whole discipline is based on the assumption of some kind of the continuity of human experience over the times. And he claims that in the current situation, our traditional historical understanding is thrown into a deep contradiction and confusion. And he is more explicit in on this other quote, namely that in this situation at the time of Anthropocene, where humans have become geological agents, not only biological agents, but also geological agents who have an impact on the very Earth, on the very planet, we cannot consider human history distinguished from the natural history. And as he concludes, the consequences of the climate change and Anthropocene make sense only if we think of humans as a form of life and look on human history as part of the history of life on this planet. And of course, this brings me to this second important topic, namely the nature-history divide. And I will try to give you a short philosophical story about how this division came about and why it doesn't work anymore. Of course, we can claim that this kind of division is quite old. We can see, let's say, in ancient Greece, the distinction between oikumene and physis. But still, I would argue that the very clear boundary was drawn not before the early 19th century. We can also formulate in a Koseliakian term that it's the outcome of the Sattelzeit, when many distinctions, conceptual distinctions, were made, including the human history versus natural history, or history versus nature. Because previously, especially within the Christian paradigm, natural history and human history were very much elements of a single story that began with the creation. And of course, I don't intend to point out who is the guilty one who invented this distinction, but I think, of course, the name of Hegel, of Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel, comes immediately into mind, although, of course, many ideas already can be found, for instance, in the work of Giambattista Vico. Now, as you might remember, Hegel writes about the nature, about the philosophy of nature, in the second volume of his Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. And again, I'm not a Hegel specialist, but to summarize his point very quickly, he makes this clear distinction that history is possible only where there is a freedom, where there is a self-awareness, and therefore, as he concludes, nature cannot have history, while science and government, etc., have history. But there's, of course, many people have been commenting on Hegel's understanding of nature and nature-history divide. I think one of the most interesting I find myself so far is an American philosopher, David Kolb, who has written a very illuminating article in Outside and In Hegel on Natural History. And he explains well, as you can see on the quote, that to be part of history, one has to be able to self-consciously and retrospectively reflect one's past, one's development. And as nature does not perform such self-aware retrospection, it cannot have history. But Kolb also reminds us that actually, according to Hegel, also, for instance, some primitive tribes and nomadic people doesn't have history because they don't have this ability for self-reflection and retrospection. Anyhow, my claim would be that this division between nature history was very much first conceptualized by Hegel, and as we will see, many later philosophers and also historians followed in his footsteps. But I'd just like to open a very short parenthesis, namely, it seems to me that there was an alternative, because the exact contemporary of Hegel, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, was, as you might remember, was a close friend of Hegel in his early days, and later a philosophical enemy. Schelling has a completely different understanding of history-nature relationship, and actually specifically the late Schelling. For Schelling, history is the highest potency of nature, and in a way he considers all history as natural history, or there is no clear boundaries between the two. Also, we have many recent interesting commentators of Schelling's philosophy of nature and history. For instance, Ian Hamilton Grant very well captures the Schelling's late philosophy of nature, claiming that according to Schelling, natural history does not consist solely in empirical accounts of the development of organizations on the Earth's surface, but its philosophical foundations make it as a science that attempts to straddle the gulf between history as the product of freedom and nature as the product of necessity, which was very much Hegel's understanding. And even better, another Schelling scholar recently, Jason Wirth, summarizes Schelling's position that for me sounds very relevant even nowadays, and namely for Schelling, all history is ultimately natural history, all nature is radically historical, hence Schelling was subverting the common bifurcation of history into human or cultural history and natural or non-human history. So in this respect, retrospectively, we could argue that there were, in the early 19th century, other options, other alternatives available. However, at least this is my claim, the first generation of professional historians took over Hegelian understanding of the distinction between nature and history. Here we have a quote from founding father of French historiography, Jules Michelet's book Introduction à l'histoire universelle, and in the preface of this book he argues that there is a kind of eternal battle between humans and nature, and while nature does not change, the humans do change and become stronger. Nature remains the same, whereas every day man gains some advantage over her. And of course, you can find similar kind of statements from the works of Jakob Burckhardt, for instance, the well-known Swiss cultural historian, and elsewhere. But I would claim that the let's say final establishment of this distinction was formulated in 1930s by different authors, and I will dwell on two of them. First is, of course, Robin Collingwood, already many times mentioned in this conference. And as you might remember, Collingwood gave a paper in May 1936 at the British Academy entitled Human Nature and Human History, which is very much a reflection about the difference between human and natural history. And this lecture was later integrated into his influential The Idea of History book, published posthumously in 1946. And as you probably know, I won't dwell longer on this, especially as we had yesterday Giuseppina's great introduction to Collingwood. Collingwood makes this distinction between, say, the external and internal events, so the outside of events and inside of events, claiming that the scientists are studying the outside of the events, describing the events as they happen, while historians are interested into the inside of the events, how those events that happen are perceived, reflected on, etc., by the humans. And therefore, as it was also reminded yesterday, he comes to the conclusion that all history is the history of thought, events as they are reflected by human mind. And this makes for him a clear distinction between two types of approach, by natural science and by historical science. And he also argues, and this discussion is very much connected to Hegel. It's a kind of explanation or elaboration on Hegel. He claims that as history is history of thought, therefore history can be only history of thinking animals, and as humans are the only thinking animals, or at least who think enough or more effectively, therefore indeed we can have only the history of humans, at least if you consider history properly. Again, it is open to discussion, my reading, but I think it is quite explicit in this. But interesting is that in the very same year, 1936, when Collingwood gave his presentation at the British Academy, another well-known British scholar, also archaeologist as Collingwood in his early days, Gordon Childe, published a book with a revelatory title, Man Makes Themselves. And also in this book, which had a huge impact on the British readership, he starts by making very explicit distinction between human and natural history, and even though he considers archaeology as a kind of bridge between the two, he still claims that prehistoric archaeology is concerned with what men made. It traces changes in human culture. And a bit later, he also makes this distinction that natural history traces the emergence of new species, while human history reveals man creating new industries and new economies that have furthered the increase of this species and thereby vindicated its enhanced fitness. And we can see indeed that humans have been most successful in making new industries and economies. But I mean, this wasn't a British discussion. For instance, just to give a last example, the well-known French historian Mark Bloch, who was writing his thoughts about the study of history during the Second World War, and the book was published later posthumously by his great close friend Lucien Febvre, Apologie pour l'histoire, the historian's craft. Remember that Bloch also defines history as a science of men in time, and he introduces this well-known image that good historian is like the giant of the fairy tale. He knows that wherever he catches this kind of human flesh, there his quarry lies. And this has been a kind of guiding line for generations of French historians. Now, having conveyed this very short philosophical story of how nature-history divide came about, I would like to offer some alternative views that, in my mind, are more relevant in our contemporary context at the time of the Anthropocene. And of course, one could easily argue that all those previously presented ideas are based on this very deep ideological and philosophical position of human exceptionalism. And yeah, I also mentioned, I think, a very interesting and important book by a French scholar, Jean-Marie Scheffer, who is actually a literary scholar, but he's also author of this 500-page long discussion of human exceptionalism and very harsh criticism of this ideology of human exceptionalism. And he also points out this fundamental antinomy that has been very widely spread over the recent decades, namely that on the one hand we do all recognize and realize that humans are not the only living beings on this planet, but many others, and actually we depend on these other life forms. But then on the other hand, we still think that humans are, for some reasons, by virtue of their species membership, qualitatively different from the other human forms, life forms, and therefore have privileges over them. And of course, the Anthropocene very much means also the end of this ideology of human exceptionalism. And in humanities, this end of human exceptionalism has been conceptualized in different ways. Recently I discovered that the Danish philosopher Sverre Raffensø has published a book, Philosophy of the Anthropocene, the Human Turn. So he calls this shift toward the non-human forms of life the human turn. It's altered relationship between humankind and its surroundings. In a way, it's an ironical term, I would say, but why not? Probably the more well-known and more widely used concept is the post-human turn or the post-humanities, etc. But as I mentioned, my own preference goes to the more than human turn. And here also I was happy to discover while preparing this paper that a young Finnish sociologist, Olli Pyhtinen from Tampere University, has published a few months ago a book, More Than Human Sociology, where he argues that also sociology needs, as I would say history needs, to become sensitive to the multiple non-human or not only human objects and materials. So it's not only about forms of life, but also on different kind of things as well, who do have agency according to this theory. Of course, when we are talking about this more than human history, the easiest way is to start by talking about animals, whether those other non-human living beings. And we have noticed the expansion of the new field called animal studies over the recent years, and I also noticed that within this field of animal studies, as exemplified in this Introduction to Animal Studies by Paul Waldo, published 2013, they also look into different story about the human past that would include also non-humans that would escape the human-centeredness. And they argue that only when we have this kind of story of our past, we can recognize that we live on a multicultural, more than human planet. But yeah, to give you some more concrete examples, I would talk a little about the animal history, but not as an innovative empirical field, but the possible epistemological consequences of animal history for history writing as such. And of course, I mean, animal history as a field is already quite venerable. It started at least in the 1960s. But for many decades, animal history meant history of human-animal relations. And it, as it is called now, it was the human history of animals. But over the last few years, there has been also attempts to write something, let's say, animal history of animals, or this kind of independent of human histories. And this, of course, is a kind of step further to what is known anthropocentric concept of history. But, of course, my question is what kind of consequences this idea of history seen from animals' point of view might have for history writing as such. I think one of the most interesting figures in this new field of animal history is Erica Fudge from Scotland, who has written many articles and books on early modern animal history. And already in 2002, she called for rethinking our past, reading it for the animals as well as the humans, and that we actually cannot understand humans without animals or in opposition to animals. But these are already the early days of this new animal history. But probably my favorite author in this field is, again, French scholar, Eric Baratet, whose recent book captures very well this idea, Le point de vue animal, the animal's point of view. And that's his attempt to write history from animals' point of view. He, of course, acknowledges that this is extremely difficult for different reasons, the lack of sources, of evidence, and then also, ultimately, every history of from animal point of view remains human history because it's written by human. However, he says that we can still make some small steps toward this animal's point of view, and this is not kind of zero-sum game, that we can still some hints, and this helps us to widen our horizon toward the past. But again, of course, the epistemological questions are here fundamental, and I will come back to this. But I wanted to give an example from his most recent book called Biographie Animale, The Animal Biographies, was published this spring. And indeed, this is a book which contains about 10 case studies of different animals, mostly from 19th to early 20th century, or the first half of the 20th century. And all those case studies are trying to reconstruct or represent the animal point of view, how these animals felt, thought, and acted. And for this, he, of course, first of all, relies on different kind of evidence. On the one hand, every possible documentation, scientific reports, journal articles, and recollections, etc. But on the other hand, on the work of ethologists, of historical ethologists. But what is interesting for me, that he also tries to invent various sort of narrative techniques and rhetorical devices and even typographical tools, how to convey this hypothetical animal perspective. And I just give you, in my clumsy translation, a very short fragment out of one chapter, which relates the story of a Spanish bull, Manolete, as she was called. I think, yeah. And he was killed on 28th of August 1947 in Linares in Spain. And it is quite often first-person narrative. It tries to convey the animal's perspective, how he eventually felt those events and what were his reactions, etc. And then in parentheses he adds in italics some kind of, let's say, human comments and explications what was really happened from humans' perspectives. And actually, it is. I mean, again, I won't argue that this is the only way to write history or animal history, but it's as a very interesting kind of example of experimental history writing that I think opens many interesting epistemological questions. And of course, is not also the only attempt to write history from animals' point of view. For instance, I like very much a recent article by a good colleague of mine, American environmental history, Tim LeCain, who tried to make sense of the cowboy culture from the cow's perspective. And indeed, he argues very well that from cow's perspective, the cowboy was just an epiphenomenon of cows. I mean, that even the very term makes sense of it. I mean, cowboy is just, boy for cows. And also the same Erika Fudge, in a recent review article for the Oxford Handbook of Animal Studies, asked what was it like to be a cow? And of course, needless to say, this is a reference to a famous Thomas Nachel's article, what is it like to be a pet? But unlike Nachel, Fudge says it is a worthwhile question, and actually, historically, we can try to answer to this. So, without claiming that we really can feel as it was, but it's question worth of considering and trying to answer. And eventually, we can come back later to this. But indeed, this, from our perspective, these epistemological questions are the most interesting one. And our good colleague, Eva Domanska, in a recent review article in the History and Theory journal, Animal History, also asked many difficult and interesting questions without answering, needless to say. But indeed, such kind of history writing from animal point of view require a different way of knowing the past from the one offered by traditional historical epistemology, with its specific understanding of time, space, change, rationality, and causality. Now let me move forward and a bit more rapidly, because I have many other things to say. Next to animal studies, I would claim that we can also think about the multi-species history. And here we can get some inspiration from anthropology, where this new field of multi-species ethnography has been introduced since 2010. And it is an attempt to consider the ways in which humans become commingled and entangled with all kinds of life forms, including microfauna, microbes, megafauna, and so on, and so forth. And we can see some interesting theoretical inspiration for this. One leading author in the field is American anthropologist Anna Tsing, who in her recent book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, actually reproaches historians that they have limited their study only to archival and written materials, and why there is no reason not to spread our attention to the tracks and traces of non-humans. And of course, those non-humans, including mushrooms, don't write history and don't tell stories. However, she claims these other organisms contribute to the overlapping tracks and traces that we grasp as history. And we can find some first examples of the multi-species history. For instance, I discovered that in the recent issue of the Environmental History Journal, Emily O'Corman has published an article which analyzes the complex of the web of humans, mosquitoes, and malaria parasites together to make sense of the important developments in early 20th century Australia. And again, I think this is also interesting from the epistemological point of view. Or another example from an American scholar, Lisa Onaga, who made a study into the humans and silkworms and technology in Meiji, Japan, and also explains that only taking into account these multi-species relations, we can make sense of important political, technological, economic developments that would be non-understandable without including these non-humans in the study. But now let's move toward the last track toward the new notion of history, and it's about deep history. Of course, the concept has become popular in recent years, and the very aim of deep history, as the very concept says, is to study those large-scale historical processes stretching back to 50,000, 500,000, why not a few millions of years of the earliest humans, or also non-humans. And we just give you this famous analog reminded by American environmental historian John Brooke recently, that if we consider 5 million years of human evolutionary time as 24-hour period, then we actually realize that this period of the modern humans, of Homo sapiens, is about hour and a half, and the moment where the modern humans left Africa is about 17 minutes. But if we even take into account the geological time of the history of the Earth, it comes out that humans have been there for a few seconds. This is even better captured by this probably well-known image, when you can see that if we consider Earth history in 24 hours, then the humans appeared on this planet something like 50 seconds ago, and Homo sapiens something like 4 or 5 seconds ago, and ancient Egypt, ancient Greece some nanoseconds ago. And this just gives us an idea that maybe the time frame historians normally are working on is not that, not that self-evident. The very notion of deep history, if I'm not mistaken, was introduced by biologist and social biologist Edward Wilson in introduction to his collection of essays In Search of Nature, where he advocated for the deep history that combines genetic and cultural changes that created humanity over hundreds of thousands of years. But I think the key work here has been done by anthropologist Andrew Shyrock and historian Taylor Lords-Mail from Harvard, and a collective volume called Deep History, which indeed for the first time tries to offer for historians kind of conceptual toolbox and empirical examples how to study deep history, how to include in the historians' toolbox also concepts from genetical studies, from different neurosciences, etc., and how to escape this very narrow time frame we have usually been working on. But my favorite example of the new deep history comes from the already mentioned John Brooke, who published 2014 a truly exciting masterpiece, more than 600 pages, which is nothing less than the history of the planet up to nowadays in connection to the global climate. And in the introduction, he explains this common attitude of historians that we don't want to include any kind of natural forces or natural agencies in human history because we can be labeled as reductionist, environmental determinist, etc. While I think his book makes very much sense of how much better we can actually understand human history if considered in a longue durée over many hundreds and thousands of years, and when the ancient Greece finds its proper place in the human history. Now, there's other examples, other concepts, just rapidly mentioning next to deep history, also evolutionary history, that more specifically focus on human impacts on the evolution of other species, as well as the co-evolution, on the human niche construction processes, etc., etc. And here we have a good example by Edmund Russell, another American environmental historian, who published this book entitled Evolutionary History, Uniting History and Biology to Understand Life on Earth. And it captures, he presents the four main theses in the introduction of his book, claiming that, again, the co-evolution processes are crucial in order to understand human history, actually. And also, it's important to understand the human-induced evolution, etc. But before I arrive to my conclusion, I would like to introduce another concept that I think relevant in the contemporary, for the new notion of history, namely the concept of multiple temporalities. Because indeed, if we take deep history seriously, we are in a deep trouble. Because how to realign those different temporal categories of long and short time, and how to synchronize those different times. And I think the only possible way is to abandon this historicist notion of linear time in history and to adopt a notion of multiple times, of a pluralistic understanding of time with its manifold rhythms, events, and trajectories. And again, I'm not the first one to reclaim a need for this kind of new notion of time in history writing. In other fields, we can see over the recent years different attempts to conceptualize this new notion of time, being it multitemporal, percolating, multi-layered, heterogeneous, or polychronic. Just a selection of concepts from different fields in humanities and social sciences. But I think the main thing is indeed to escape this concept of linear time, and Chris Lawrence has been in history and in the philosophy of history one of those who has advocated for over the last 10 years or so the need to transcend this linear time divided into clearly distinguished past, present, and future, and actually we need to have a more multidimensional and purely relational concept of time. And another scholar I find particularly inspiring this concept in this context is the Norwegian historian and philosopher of history, Helge Jordheim, who organized in the History and Theory journal some years ago a forum on multiple temporalities, that his concept. And he also connects it to this concept of deep time and the concept of Anthropocene, and claiming the same ways I'm doing here, that those new concepts challenge the limited temporal horizons of social relations and political decisions, and forces us to renegotiate our views of past and future. And now, let me just conclude my talk with a few general points. First, I believe indeed that the emergence of the Anthropocene, even it's still an hypothesis of Anthropocene, while we have a lot of evidence that argues for these concepts, that this Anthropocene opens the possibility that history as a concept will be conceptualized in a novel and unexpected ways, will be widened up, and this new potentiality, in my mind, has a great number of epistemological, but also, I would say, ethical implications, and that we have only now begun to recognize. And as you noticed, I have mostly questions to offer for you, not really answers. So that's maybe the beginning of a long route. And more specifically, I believe, and this was the aim of this talk today, that we need a notion of history that includes all forms of life without this human nature division, and I call it more than human history, that extends in the deep past, what we could call deep history, and of course this deep history also, and this new notion of history requires a new concept of time, which supports the interaction and integration of multiple time scales that we could call, after your time, multiple temporalities. So this was my sermon of today. Thank you.
Thank you for an extremely interesting presentation. It's time for discussion, and let's start from there.
Thank you. Thank you for a very thought-provoking talk. First, the historical note of the controversy between Hegel and Schelling. I think Schelling is talking about history in terms of objective changes in the world, whereas Hegel is talking about Geschichtserzählung, which is more of a historical writing. And the primitive tribes, for example, don't have the history writing, perhaps maybe because they don't have letters, but also because they don't have the socially recognized need to conceptualize the historical changes of their social institutions. Mm-hmm. In this sense, they do not have history. They are, of course, subject of history in the sense that objective historical changes are happening there. And this kind of a dilemma can be carried over to the human-animal contradiction as well, even if we have histories. Now, from the animal point of view, it is still a curious fact that these histories are written by humans. So the very historiography is carried out by humans. That is one controversy. And the question related to that is that when you talk about the novelty of this more than human history, isn't all the evolutionary biology that started from Darwin already this more than a human? A historical change is not from the human point of view. I think Darwin was exactly accused in bringing out a story of historical changes that were not focused on the human or not from the human point of view. That was a very accusation already then. But I think we have already an established discipline of evolutionary biology or historical anthropology that has been doing that for some time already.
Yeah, thank you. These are very relevant and sensible questions. First, I have to admit, I'm not a Hegel or Schelling scholar, unlike you, but I know there's a lot of discussions going on what Hegel had in mind by using this concept of Geschichte or Geschichtlichkeit, whatever, whether it's history or history writing and the different interpretations. But I still tend to think that even if those quotations I gave do not make the justice to Hegel's understanding, I still tend to think that there is a fundamental difference between Schelling and Hegel, how they conceptualize the relations between human and history and nature. And of course, there are a lot of other debates around, including the role of God, because for Schelling, of course, nature and history come together in this kind of universal divine plan, etc. But I think there is still a point, but this is probably a separate discussion, and I'm not enough qualified for this, let's say. Then what comes to the last point, in a way, yes, indeed. I mean, that's a problem that historians never took Darwin enough seriously, and also Lyell. I mean, all this early geology and biology was almost ignored, I would claim, by the modern founding fathers of history. And that's actually something we have to do now, reunite geology and biology into history, and try to, because of course, I mean, Darwin, he wasn't an historian, but he was making interesting evolutionary history indeed. But we have to, how to say, conceptualize all these Darwinian and other types of approach into specifically historical research. And this was my claim very much. And in between, what was the second question?
What about the point that histories of animals are still...
Yeah, okay, yeah. That's, of course, I mean, that's eternal debate, and of course, Nature's Peace, what is like to be a bat, is an important text here that, needless to say, yes, even the ultimate animal history remains somehow human, although they have some proposition that we should start writing articles together with animals. And in ethology, we have first examples of chimpanzees being co-authors of articles. But then, of course, it can be a kind of source-centric approach. This is another problematic as much as anthropocentric. But indeed, but I think, that, again, as I said, it's not zero-sum game. That it's not that we just give up because we are humans. I think we still have to make some attempts to grasp some possible hypothetical points of view of animals in the past. So, and I think it's very inspiring exercise as such, if it's done in a proper way, not like fiction writers who have, well, since Cervantes, I mean, there have been talks, etc. I mean, in the case of Paraté, he's fully aware what he's doing, and is everything evidence-based. It's not just out of his imagination. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. You create in your presentation an impression that everything in environmental humanities has happened after Anthropocene. But as you certainly know, environmental history, environmental sociology, environmental philosophy have been established disciplines already 50 years, beginning from the United States. And I would like to ask, does this concept of Anthropocene offer anything new if you think, for instance, the environmental history since the 1960s, it discussed already erosion, soil degradation, urbanization, climate changes, and so on. Also animal histories.
Yeah, to complete.
Anything new? I don't see anything new.
Well, that's a matter of taste. I've read quite a lot of this early environmental history. It's a most important source of inspiration, and I don't argue that everything started overnight. Of course, every phenomenon has its kind of roots, and it takes time. But I think we can say, in this way, that there has been a radicalization of this environmental history and environmental humanities into something first much more multidisciplinary and much more widespread and much widely recognized, because environmental history was for decades a very minor field. Even within the American academy, it was completely almost unknown in Europe, because environmental history in Europe started, I don't know, in 1990s. But I think these are the different kind of ingredients or elements that put together environmental history, deep history, evolutionary history, all those kinds, that actually give us what I call the modern human history. But there's no revolution here, just a gradual radicalization process.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I want to kind of offer you a way of making the nature history distinction that is not based on a form of human exceptionalism. Because I think that if you say that that is what the distinction is based on, then you can go to where? You have to say, well, either human beings are distinct from non-human animals, because we can pick up some empirical features like they're featherless bipeds who build churches and mosques and other kind of monuments, and they write books, whereas the other animals don't. Or you make an epistemological distinction and you say human beings have a developed psychology that animals don't. But here is another way of drawing a distinction, which is to say, well, that's not the distinction. It's a distinction between two kinds of way in which we can explain what there is. We can explain it evolutionary, or we can explain it, as in a different way, theologically, or and if you draw the distinction in that way, then I think some of what drives this, perhaps, it pulls a little bit like the rug out, because what's objectionable is human exceptionalism. But if you draw the distinction in that way, it's no longer exceptionalism. Because you can can write the history pigs. I mean, if they are responding to those, then that is such a thing.
No, I do understand your point, and in a certain way I do agree with. But still, I would argue that if you say that different ways of understanding, that my claim is that this traditional way of understanding that is anthropocentric doesn't let us understand the history of this planet, including our own human life, because, as I try to argue, we are intermingled. We have the humans cannot be understood being isolated from the other life forms.
That's right, but the distinction is a conceptual one. It's like, okay, think about something like Kant's distinction between actions that are done out of duty and actions which are done for the sake of duty. There is no empirical distinction there. There's interminglement, as you put it. They're one and the same. But you can nonetheless say they exemplify different principles. And so you could say, look, I can distinguish. I don't need to divide the human from the non-human in order to disentangle the form of exploration, because the distinction is conceptual, it's not empirical.
Okay, I do. Maybe I kind of demonize too much this distinction. Of course, as scholars, we have to make distinctions. That the very starting point of any scholarly inquiry. But I think, but it makes maybe sense to try to make new kind of distinction, new kind of conceptual distinctions that might maybe give us another take on the human past, and maybe it doesn't mean that the previous distinctions are completely bad or evil, but I think we could try some other kind of conceptual distinctions in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating stuff. I can see how this changes history writing. There will be, as you say, new objects, monkeys and cows, and the scope will be...
New subjects. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Even that. Scope will be different in epochs, and so on. But I think someone like Latour is actually more radical still.
Yeah, in a way.
He is not happy with that, but he wants to renew the explanatory categories, even the ontologies. So he introduces, supposedly neutral term like actant, or in some of his accounts, scallops or non-human animals are acting forces, agents that influences history. So my question will be, would you follow him or people like him that far, and should we rather be focusing on the influence between human and non-human actors, and think about, let's say, French Revolution? Would the history of French Revolution change, and how would it change if we are now relying on non-human agents or actants, or how we want to call them? And then what would be after that the role of non-conventional, let's call narratives of the human-centered narratives of the French Revolution? Are they impoverished without this kind of non-human influence? Or is this what you're suggesting, if you follow all the way here, this is just another alternative perspective on how to practice?
Yeah, again, good questions, and I can be more radical indeed, and follow Latour also toward the animated things, not because I was indeed focusing mostly here on the other life forms, non-human in the sense that other non-human beings. But I do believe indeed that actually we should take another step and include things in the widest possible term within this modern human history, as actually Olli Pyhtinen was arguing in the case of modern human sociology, that also non-animated but still things with agency should be taken into account. But this would be another story, and I'm not prepared for this today. But indeed, I see it. It can be even widened up, and actually, why not to consider all of those different participants, be it human, non-human, things alive, as some kind of actants that carry on, in a way, the historical process. That what comes to this future history of French Revolution, I do believe indeed that there will be, and quite soon, this kind of modern human history of French Revolution. I can give you one example. A French environmental historian, Grégory Quenet, published 2 years ago an environmental history of Versailles, which is the example that comes closest to the French Revolution. I think it was a highly interesting story about the Versailles written from non-human perspective, let's say. Actually, how, because Versailles is a completely unnatural phenomenon. I mean, a huge building built in the middle of nowhere without any actually natural infrastructure, and it had a colossal environmental impact. And many problems that actually Louis XIV had was not because of political or economic events, because natural disasters that he created. And as you remember, French Revolution very much started by this kind of the lack of bread and this kind of, things are connected. So in this respect, I believe that we can have written more than human perspective, completely different idea of French Revolution, many other things. But I wouldn't go that far that all the other versions are obsolete. I think I'm a pluralist. I think different perspectives make sense. But I'm interested in how this could actually also impact the very way we understand history and write history and what are the future forms of history writing.
First of all, many thanks for your very interesting lecture, from which I have learned a whole lot.
Good.
And one of the lectures that you will never forget. I have a question, and as you will probably not be surprised, it's a question from the perspective of narrative.
Yeah.
Let me phrase it this way. In 1970, a very nice book came out by Haskell Fane, and it was called Between Philosophy and History. And then he asked himself the question, what is a narrative? And he dealt with it from various perspectives, but he said, well, one of the requirements is that it should have a certain consistency in the kind of topic that it deals with. For example, if you're doing intellectual history or political history, and you talk about what goes on in the mind of some politician or military leader, but then suddenly start talking about what are the neurophysiological aspects of the thought, you lose your reader. He has no idea, he doesn't see the connection, even though there may be a causal connection. If what you think, well, there's a causal connection between what you think and the neurophysiological ways that influence your thoughts. Well, that's actually the background of my question to you. Suppose you wish to write history in the way you propose, so history in the age of the Anthropocene, then you get a huge variety of topics that are involved, will have to be involved, that will have to be taken up in history, but what you will also need, at least if you wish to tell a coherent story, is that you continuously explain how these things hang together. For example, Joey was already talking about the French Revolution, how does that perhaps hang together with what happened in the shoes in Paris at that time, something like that. Did it or did it not, and how are the relations? So my question is basically this one: the further the distance becomes, or the greater the distance becomes, or the greater becomes the amount of topics that are involved in history of the Anthropocene, and it's quite likely, as I've explained to us, that it includes virtually all aspects of the world in which we are living, then, yeah, the subject, which the guiding subject of the story, will disappear, and moreover, if still you would have such a guiding subject, you could postulate, for example, I'm going to tell the history of this art, then all the interconnections relating all these different layers to this history of the art, that will add up to a problem which is impossible to realize.
Thank you. And indeed, it is difficult, but it's not impossible. First of all, we have already examples, and actually, I think the earliest examples, which is not exactly in the same way that I was arguing for, but comes close to it, the Ferdinand Proddel's, the famous Mediterranean book. And it is an attempt to articulate narratively very different layers of time, including geological time to a certain extent. And I think he succeeded very well inventing this kind of narrative in 3 volumes, indeed 3 different bases, how to tell a story that has many layers. And as I mentioned, this book by Brooke, which is a history of the planet up to nowadays, is again a very successful example how to combine those different topics and different time scales and different perspectives within one single narrative. So it is possible, I would say, although it is difficult, but I mean, that's the most interesting thing in history. I mean, it has to be difficult. It has to challenge your imagination. And also, I even believe that we don't have to think about history in the term of single narrative. We can also see some new forms of history writing, more fragmentary, more hypertextual, more digital in the way that you can, move between different mediums, etc. So why not? So I think it's difficult, but it's also inspiring.
So I want to thank you for presenting all this material in a sort of well-organized, well-graduated way. And it concerns issues that even people who reject the ontology of object-oriented ontology, the ontologies involved in here, such as I do, have to consider and take into thinking about history. What I want to comment on is not so much the content, but from a disciplinary point of view. It seems to me that it is exactly this domain of thinking that philosophy of history is ideally suited to be the center for academic consideration of. In part because philosophy of history does not have a traditional departmental home. It's just because it doesn't have that, then it can be a place where biology and evolutionary science and all kinds of material sciences as well as art and various aspects of other aspects of history can be considered. It's exactly this kind of thing which so many people are thinking about, which would philosophy of history is ideally suited to develop as an academic study if we can find a name for philosophy of history that somehow expresses all this complexity and doesn't just bring to mind Hegel's philosophy of history or discussions of historical methodology. Some other presentations in this conference have brought up some other such domains. For example, the presentation on art and aesthetics, discussion of transhumanism, discussion of anachrony in this room the other day. These are, and several others are leading edges of critical thought that are purely interdisciplinary. And I just want to say, when we think about this conference, is that there's no better academic home for them than philosophy of history. We know philosophy of history can handle these, but it tends to be an isolated moon in the academic galaxy. But if somehow we can name it and properly and explain it properly, it's the place where studies of those from all different places come together.
I do agree very much, indeed. We have all the tools necessary.
Thank you, that's fascinating. I'm trying to say you don't need multiple clients.
Okay.
Although you can have them, and that's done. You can examples of people who've done precisely that. It can be done. You don't need it for the following reason. Let me go back a bit to Vico, who suggested it was at the roots of this distinction.
Verum est factum principle.
Well, exactly, yes. I mean, God made the natural world, so only God can understand it, right? Mankind made the human world, so man can understand that. And then a lot of philosophy of history follows on from that. Traditional ways of doing it. Empathy, for example, I was kind of very fond of at the moment, and so on. And that kind of thing is perfectly natural, and so forth. And in fact, you get an example in this Barate thing where we try to imagine ourselves in the situation of a bull and such like. Similarly, with nature, we might think of Mother Nature. There's various ways in which we anthropomorphize the natural world. But the point about Vico's position is this. If you say to Vico, actually, Vico, do you realize that now, and this is the whole point of this new system, the Anthropocene, man is making the natural world too.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
And he's then going to say, well, in that case, what I've said about how we understand it it all reduces to the way in which we understand humanity.
That's
so
good.
It's all been done
Okay.
the same way. So we don't need anything special here. And then we simply say, well, we're doing history now of both the natural and the human worlds, and we need to make a distinction at all. So where then would there be a time difference? Well, you've shown us the time difference. If these wonderful things, which we're only 4 seconds of all the rest of it, but it's precisely for that reason, precisely because the human things we're interested in operate in that tiny space, that tiny time, as it were, whereas all these vast geological and interstellar changes are so much vaster. We don't need to worry about it. It only matters when, as you argue yourself, there is the great acceleration. It's only now, in other words, with the great acceleration, that the time scale of nature actually coincides with the time scale of the human.
Indeed.
Right? So forget all those billions of years. We don't need to have, in that sense, multiple time scales, because you've got the one time scale. Because of the great acceleration, it's the same time. And in fact, it's now, and arguably, it wasn't true, shall we say, before 1800, because you could treat the world, the actual world, as fixed, as separate. You still anthropomorphize it in a way, legal Bacon, putting nature to the question, and so forth, or a general sense that time started in 4004 BC, or any of that stuff. I mean, you can kind of get away with it as a historian. It's only now when we suddenly realise actually we're making these changes that yield this new concept of Anthropocene, and that only works because we have the same time frame. You do not need multiple ones, although of course you don't have them.
Okay, that's a very good point, and I will not dwell longer because to leave time for the others, but that's very generous reading of Vico, and that's actually a very good point indeed. I mean, he doesn't specify what is made by human, and if we consider from the Anthropocene perspective that everything is made by human on this planet right now, at least in the human participation, then indeed there is actually no room for God left, because everything is human. And about time sets there, I think I do agree, but I think also becoming aware of being a geological agent also opens up eyes toward the past and toward making sense of longer distances when the humans were not really a geological force yet. So I think it doesn't exclude each other to be focused on this great acceleration, but still to reinterpret the past on the light of this present situation.
My question was in the same direction to the last question, but a bit different. Within the concept of the Anthropocene, there seem to be two overlapping concepts, two different directions which it goes. We want to say the Anthropocene decenters humanity, or it goes against human exceptionalism. And the other is that humans become geological agents of a new kind of geological age, which is then the Anthropocene, which literally means the age of humans, and climate change, mass species extinction, where the main causal driver obviously is humanity, or a kind of society humanity, capitalism, whatever you call it then. So in a way there are two notions of the Anthropocene. One is that humans are the geological agents now, because it is time only in that time. In that sense, is there decentering? I don't know, and how they decenter. The other one
I see the point. But actually, okay, sorry.
And the other one would then be this anti-ideological thrust, to go against what was it called, nature history divide, animal history, multi-species ethnography and all that, that's all fine. But that, as some would argue, is not that new, or there are a lot of people who have done or tried to do things like that, maybe in a different way, not by Latour, for a long time. Pace, like Hegel. So the main point seems to be the first point, that humans become geological agents. That is the main point. Then it's centered on humans, or their society, capitalism, or their way of doing things.
I see your point, indeed. First, I mean, these are let's say, the two sides of the same coin in the concept of the first point. Indeed, Anthropocene as a term refers human as a kind of a geological force, and in this respect we can't see about the decenterness of humanness. But when I talk about that we have to decenter humans, this is the outcome of the Anthropocene in this respect. And as we know that we are responsible for this planet, and for all life forms. This means that we have to pay attention to the other life forms as well, and this is the cause of the centeredness of humans. That's the outcome of modern human. I mean, let's say the modern human history, in my point, is the reaction to Anthropocene in this respect. In that now we are aware that we cannot isolate humans from the rest of the world because we have a huge impact on those other life forms. And actually, they have also impact on us. So in this respect, it's kind of, if you call it dialectical, if you like. But as to the next point, again, I don't want to argue that this is something brand new, inédit, as they say in French, as was said before. I mean, of course, there are many scholars, including Latour, all the active network theory, and many others have contributed toward this kind of thinking. I just tried to make a new constellation to accumulate those different elements that come sometime long ago. Even Fernand Braudel, I never mentioned, is actually can be read also from this perspective as an important predecessor of this kind of multitemporal modern human version of history. So it's not about novelty here. I don't reclaim to be, yeah.
Because I completely agree with you in the fact that much of the things that you reviewed, especially all these animal studies and stuff like this, it is about we are trying to overcome, anthropocentrism, which I think is just philosophically unfeasible enterprise. And generally speaking, it has serious flaws, and it itself is an anthropocentric agenda to overcome anthropocentrism because it matters for you objectively. So you are the one who tries to do it. It's just completely, to me, like Donna Haraway, and whenever I
companionship.
Completely. And on the other hand, when you read all these things about the Anthropocene and also about technology as such, which is the unprecedented powers of human creation and stuff like this, this is human exceptionalism on the top. And the point is, the reason why I think it's not just two sides of the same coin, because you do not want to stop to act into nature. You are not going to stop initiating, natural processes. You are going to continue this, and you are going to continue this on the basis of your super anthropocentric view, because if you stop it, then you will opt out of what we think today is civilization, and then you start to go backwards, and then again you will involve this very old kind of idea of history if you try to act against it. So the point is that you are actually very fine with this kind of human exceptionalism, and it's also in technology. I mean, what Elon Musk wants, right? And things like this, it's not going to stop, and you do not want to stop it. And it is on the premise of human exceptionalism. And if you do, or if you try to do what all these animal studies people want, it's a completely and a conflicting imperative. I don't see how it is, two sides at the same point.
Marek, the point was made that Balthazar and the other gentleman made by someone who said that the Anthropocene should be entitled the post-Anthropocene.
Again, that's very. In a way, I wanted to avoid to go into this Anthropocene debate. It's a very wide. I mean, there's people who hate Anthropocene. There's Capitalocene, Petrocene. There's a lot of different titles and labels, and of course you have a point, and that's also why some people try to avoid the concept of Anthropocene, because it's an anthropocentric concept. And of course, and it's deeply flawed in this respect. And but I mean, and I do agree basically with you that actually I'm not that optimistic in this respect that we can overcome human exceptionalists, that we can make some major change. I think we can't. I think in this case the work is done. I mean, the damage is done. What I'm trying to do is maybe to slow down a bit. Because most probably the human species won't survive too much on this planet anymore. That's for that. I mean, for humans, indeed. But of course, it will be the rest of the life forms will be most happy when humans will be gone. Yeah, and I think actually the horizon of thinking nowadays is the world after us. That's the only option left, I think. But I mean, it's another kind of deep discussion. And of course, I'm talking here about let's say post-humanism. But of course, as you were talking in your lecture, there is also another future scenario, which is transhumanism, which is a bit comes close to Elon Musk idea in a way.
Posthumanism is that you bring about literally post-human beings, not some metaphorical understanding of posthumanism based on humanist criticism. So that's the difference between the two. But again, just to phrase it as a question, so if you will try to overcome anthropocentrism, why, if you think that it's a good thing, what would you do about, does it necessarily qualify as a bad thing, everything that, let's say, natural science has achieved in the 20th and 21st century?
No, not necessarily.
Would you like to stop it because it's...
No, I'm not...
...imagined and anthropocentric?
No, I think there is gray zones. You don't have to be on two extremes. To embrace all technological, scientific progress, or I don't know, become savage again. I mean, there's some middle ways that I'm more advocating for. But that's a very complicated debate. I'm not even sure I'm qualified for this. I'm more focused on the relevance for history writing here, not about the Anthropocene as a concept and the future of humanity. It's a problem.
Time is almost up. I think we could have maybe 2 small questions, not mini lectures.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'm an anthropologist doing multi-species ethnography.
Good.
Actually, even Eben Kirksey was here 2 weeks ago.
Ah, good.
So I'm totally with you here. This is great.
Good.
And I'm working with archaeologists and historians on human-animal questions and how we can, like, from post-humanist point of view. And like historians like Taina Syrjama in Turku, they're doing history from like animal agency point of view. So they're trying to find the animal view from historical documents, their photos, and I'm doing research on child animal image. So I think this is so important right now that we take a look of the animals too, because we are part of them and they're part of us. You know, we're part pig and cow, whatever. So I think we have to look at them and create the world together with them. So this is just a comment, and I think this is very inspiring thing. So I actually don't have questions. I'm just
Thank you.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah, this is tremendously stimulating. And I'm thinking of Fourier and I'm thinking of Wallace, both of whom imagine a nature that is completely subject to a superhuman agency. In Wallace's case, it's God is up there. The sea is turning into lemonade in Fourier, and something very similar to Wallace. It occurs to me that we need to think, maybe what's distinctive about the Anthropocene, I'm just thinking out loud here, is the coming in of a new form of contra-human agency. That is to say, our tremendous power in changing nature has initiated a new form of nature working back upon us. So it's a kind of an unresolving dialectic between the massive new powers of human agency on the one hand, and the emergence of new forms of ways in which nature works against humans on the other. And in that sense, the Anthropocene, it's too simple to see the Anthropocene as the age in which human domination of nature has become geometrically greater than before. It's really the age in which there are new forms of contra-human agency emerging, precisely because of the technological power of human beings, which turns out to be a limited power.
Yeah. In a way, nature strikes back, indeed.
Exactly.
I do agree,
Okay. That was stimulating.
Thank you.
I believe I'm glad to have you.
Thank you. Thank you.